On a rain-soaked April morning at Willowbrook Animal Shelter, the decision had already been made. Atlas, a 2-year-old German shepherd with eyes that spoke of unwavering loyalty despite his broken body, was scheduled for euthanasia. The veterinarians had exhausted all conventional treatments for his sudden paralysis, and the crowded municipal shelter couldn't justify the resources for a dog deemed unadoptable. But fate has a curious way of intervening when hope seems lost, and in this case, it arrived in rain boots 2 sizes too big and clutching a backpack filled with half-completed homework and extraordinary determination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The skies over Mapleton had been weeping for 3 days straight, turning the small Midwestern town's streets into shallow rivers and its parks into miniature lakes. The constant drumming of raindrops against the metal roof of Willowbrook Animal Shelter created a somber soundtrack that matched the mood inside. Dr. Eleanor Winters checked her clipboard one final time, her experienced eyes scanning the euthanasia schedule with the detached professionalism that 15 years of shelter medicine had instilled in her. Atlas, German shepherd, male, approximately 2 years old, acute posterior paralysis of unknown origin, failed to respond to standard treatments, scheduled for humane euthanasia at 2 p.m. Eleanor sighed, pushing a strand of graying hair behind her ear. She had entered veterinary medicine with dreams of healing every animal that crossed her path, but shelter reality had tempered those ideals with harsh pragmatism. Limited budgets, overcrowded facilities, and the constant stream of abandoned and abused animals had taught her to focus her energy where it could make the most difference. A young dog with complete hindquarter paralysis and no owner willing to take responsibility for his care simply couldn't justify the resources in a system already stretched beyond capacity. In his kennel at the far end of the West Wing, Atlas lay on his side, his powerful front legs occasionally attempting to drag his unresponsive lower body into a more comfortable position. Unlike many of the shelter's residents who barked desperately for attention whenever someone passed, Atlas maintained a dignified silence, his amber eyes following movements with intelligent awareness. His coat, once gleaming black and tan, had dulled during his 3 weeks at Willowbrook, but the shelter volunteers had done their best to keep him clean and comfortable despite his condition. Madison Taylor had chosen that rainy Tuesday to visit the shelter entirely by coincidence, or so it seemed at the time. At 8 years old, she was already known throughout Mapleton Elementary School for her unwavering dedication to animals. Her bedroom walls were covered with drawings of creatures both domestic and wild, and her bookshelf overflowed with animal encyclopedias and veterinary guides far beyond her grade level. She had convinced her mother, Sarah, to bring her to Willowbrook after completing her weekly chores with unusual efficiency. "Just for an hour, Mom," she had pleaded. "The dogs get sad when it rains and nobody visits them. Please?" Sarah Taylor, a physical therapist at Mapleton Regional Hospital, had relented, as she usually did when her daughter's compassion was involved. As a single mother working full-time, she worried about Madison's intensity sometimes, the way she threw herself completely into causes, especially those involving animal welfare. But she also recognized the rare quality of empathy that seemed to have been born in her daughter, emerging almost as soon as Madison could talk. When they entered the shelter, shaking rain from their jackets, the front desk volunteer greeted them with surprise. "We don't get many visitors on days like this," she explained, handing them a visitor log. "Most of the dogs are in the West, a wing. Feel free to look, but please don't open any kennel doors without staff assistance." Madison nodded seriously, already scanning the row of kennels visible through the interior door. Her small hand clutched her mother's as they began their tour, stopping at each enclosure to greet its occupants. Madison had a ritual at these visits. She would kneel before each kennel, make eye contact with its resident, and whisper something only the animal could hear. Sarah had never asked what these private communications contained, respecting her daughter's solemn ceremony. They had nearly completed their circuit of the adoption floor when Madison noticed a door marked "Staff Only" slightly ajar. Before Sarah could stop her, curiosity pulled Madison toward the opening, and she peered through to the kennel area beyond. "Madison, we shouldn't go in there," Sarah whispered, reaching for her daughter's shoulder. But Madison had already seen him, the German shepherd lying motionless in the last kennel, his eyes somehow finding hers across the distance. Something in those eyes called to her with an urgency she couldn't explain. "Mom, look at that dog. He's sad," Madison said, her voice carrying the absolute certainty children sometimes possess. Dr. Winters emerged from a nearby treatment room just as Madison slipped through the door, moving with surprising quickness toward Atlas's kennel. "I'm sorry," Sarah apologized, hurrying after her daughter. "Madison, come back here, please. We're not supposed to be in this area." But Madison had already dropped to her knees before Atlas's enclosure, her small fingers curling around the kennel bars. The German shepherd, sensing her presence, struggled to raise his head, his front paws scrabbling for purchase on the smooth, concrete floor. "He's trying to come say hi, but his back legs aren't working," Madison observed with the matter-of-fact clarity of a child. She turned to Dr. Winters, who had approached with a concerned expression. "Is he sick?" Eleanor hesitated, unaccustomed to explaining these situations to children. Professional ethics guided her to be truthful but appropriate. "He has an injury that makes it impossible for him to walk properly," she explained carefully. "And yes, he is in this special area because he needs extra care." Madison's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze shifting between the veterinarian and the dog with uncanny perception. "Are you going to help him walk again?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple, yet loaded with moral complexity. Eleanor felt Sarah's eyes on her, recognizing the familiar look of a parent hoping for a gentle evasion rather than a harsh truth. "We've tried several treatments," Eleanor replied, choosing her words carefully. "But his condition is very serious, and we have limited resources here at the shelter." Madison turned back to Atlas, who had managed to pull himself closer to the kennel door, his nose now inches from her small fingers. His tail, lying limply behind him, gave a single, weak thump against the floor. "He's not giving up," Madison stated firmly. "See, he still wants to try." Dr. Winters felt something shift uncomfortably in her chest. After years of necessary emotional detachment, she had developed efficient defenses against the heartbreak inherent in shelter medicine. But there was something about the absolute conviction in this child's voice that bypassed those carefully constructed barriers. Sarah placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Madison, honey, I think we should let Dr. Winters get back to her work. Maybe we can see some of the other dogs that—" "What's his name?" Madison interrupted, her eyes never leaving the shepherd. "Atlas," Dr. Winters answered, surprising herself with the catch in her voice. "His name is Atlas." "Like the one who held up the whole world," Madison nodded, recognition flashing in her eyes. "We learned about him in school. He was super strong." The simple connection struck Eleanor with unexpected force. The mythological Atlas bore the weight of the heavens as punishment from Zeus, an impossible burden carried with enduring strength. Looking at the German shepherd's dignified struggle to maintain connection with the small girl before him, the parallel seemed suddenly, painfully apt. "Mom," Madison said, turning to Sarah with an expression of absolute seriousness, "this dog needs what you do." "What I do?" Sarah echoed, confused. "Physical therapy," Madison clarified, as though stating the obvious. You help people walk again when they have accidents. Mr. Grayson couldn't walk after his stroke, and now he can. Go to the mailbox by himself. You showed me the videos. The simplicity of the connection hit Sarah with surprising force. As a physical therapist specializing in neurological rehabilitation, she had indeed worked with numerous patients recovering from conditions that had initially left them wheelchair-bound. She had shown Madison some of the more dramatic recovery videos during a career day presentation at her school, carefully selected cases that demonstrated the potential of dedicated rehabilitation. "Honey, animals are different," Sarah began gently. "What works for humans doesn't always—" "Actually," Dr. Winters interrupted, a strange new light in her eyes, "there have been significant advances in canine physical therapy and rehabilitation. Hydrotherapy, in particular, has shown promising results in cases like this." The words seemed to form themselves without conscious decision, emerging from a part of her that still believed in possibilities rather than limitations. Eleanor found herself looking at Atlas with new eyes, not as a statistic or an unfortunate case, but as an individual with potential that perhaps hadn't been fully explored. Madison's face brightened instantly. Like swimming, Atlas could learn to swim with his back legs, even if he can't walk yet. Eleanor nodded slowly, professional curiosity beginning to override her practiced pragmatism. Water therapy provides buoyancy that makes it easier for injured animals to attempt movement without bearing full weight, and there are specialized harnesses and equipment. She trailed off, suddenly aware that she was describing treatments far beyond Willowbrook's modest capabilities and budget. The reality of the shelter's limitations reasserted itself, and she felt the familiar weight of practical constraints. The challenge is that those treatments require specialized facilities and ongoing care commitment, she explained more carefully. Our shelter isn't equipped for that level of rehabilitation. Sarah had gone quiet, her professional mind clearly processing the situation from a new angle. As a physical therapist, she understood the principles of rehabilitation better than most. She found herself studying Atlas with an evaluative gaze, noting the good muscle tone in his front quarters, the absence of pressure sores despite his immobility, the clear alertness in his eyes. "What exactly happened to him?" she asked, her voice taking on the clinical precision she used when reviewing new patient cases. Dr. Winters consulted her clipboard. "He was found abandoned near the interstate 3 weeks ago, already paralyzed. X-rays showed no spinal fractures, and blood work was surprisingly normal. We suspect a fibrocartilaginous embolism, essentially a spinal cord stroke, but without advanced imaging like an MRI, we can't confirm." "And those often have some potential for recovery, don't they?" Sarah asked, recalling articles she'd read on comparative neurology. A tentative connection was forming in the rain-dampened shelter corridor. 3 individuals from different worlds beginning to orbit around a possibility none of them had expected to discover that grey Tuesday afternoon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Eleanor Winters found herself in an unexpected position as she stood outside Atlas's kennel, her euthanasia schedule clipboard suddenly feeling heavier in her hands. For 15 years, she had navigated the difficult balance between compassion and practicality that shelter medicine demanded. She had made thousands of life or death decisions based on clear protocols, designed to allocate limited resources where they could do the most good. Yet something about this particular interaction, a paralyzed German shepherd and an 8-year-old girl with absolute conviction, had disrupted her carefully maintained professional equilibrium. FCE cases do sometimes show improvement with intensive rehabilitation, Dr. Winters admitted, speaking more to herself than to Madison or Sarah. The challenge is that recovery requires consistent, specialized care over weeks or months, with no guarantee of success. Sarah Taylor's professional interest was now fully engaged. As a physical therapist who had dedicated her career to helping patients recover from neurological injuries, she recognized the familiar territory of uncertainty and potential that characterized rehabilitation medicine. Every patient represented a unique equation of damage and resilience, with recovery dependent on factors both measurable and mysterious. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Sarah asked, her tone shifting subtly from curious visitor to consulting professional. Dr. Winters checked her watch reflexively, acutely aware that Atlas's scheduled euthanasia was less than 2 hours away. Normally, we'd want to see some signs of neurological improvement within the first month post-injury. Atlas has been here 3 weeks with minimal change in his condition. Our shelter protocol classifies cases like his as having poor prognosis for adoption. Madison, who had been listening to this adult conversation with intense focus, suddenly looked up with alarm. "Are you going to make him go to sleep?" she asked, her voice small but direct. The question created an immediate tension in the corridor. Sarah placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder, while Dr. Winters recognized she had reached one of those moments where clinical euphemisms failed in the face of a child's perception. "Madison," Sarah began gently, "Dr. Winters has to make very difficult decisions about which animals—" "Yes," Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with her candor. "Atlas is scheduled for euthanasia this afternoon. We have many animals who need homes, and our resources are limited." Madison's face underwent a transformation that moved from shock to determination with the rapid emotional fluidity unique to children. "No!" she stated firmly, as though her refusal alone could alter reality. "He just needs help learning to walk again, like Mom's patience." She turned to her mother with absolute certainty. "Mom, remember Mr. Delgado? He couldn't move his legs either, but you helped him. You said his brain just needed to find new paths to talk to his muscles." Sarah felt a complicated surge of emotions, pride in her daughter's compassionate understanding, concern about the unrealistic expectations being formed, and a surprising flicker of professional curiosity about whether canine neurological rehabilitation might indeed offer possibilities for Atlas. Spinal cord injuries in dogs follow similar recovery patterns to humans in many ways, Sarah acknowledged carefully. "But Madison, even if Atlas could benefit from rehabilitation, we don't have the special equipment or—" "What about your clinic?" Madison persisted. "You have the walking harnesses and the underwater treadmill and everything?" Dr. Winters raised an eyebrow. "You have hydrotherapy equipment at your facility?" Sarah nodded, momentarily distracted by the professional question. "Yes, Mapleton Regional invested in a comprehensive rehabilitation center last year. We have an underwater treadmill, parallel bars with harness systems, and a therapy pool, primarily for stroke and spinal cord injury patients." "And is any of this equipment ever used for canine rehabilitation?" Dr. Winters asked, a theoretical possibility beginning to take shape in her mind. "Not currently," Sarah admitted, though the equipment manufacturer actually mentioned that their systems were adaptable for veterinary use. They originally designed them for both markets. Madison, sensing the adults were beginning to consider possibilities rather than obstacles, pressed her advantage. Atlas could be the first dog patient, a pilot program. The term pilot program, emerging from an 8-year-old, would have been amusing under different circumstances, but Dr. Winters recognized it as exactly the kind of institutional framing that might transform an impossible request into a potentially viable project. Hospitals and medical centers regularly established pilot programs to test new approaches without committing to permanent policy changes. "It's not that simple, Madison," Sarah explained gently. "The hospital has protocols about facility use, insurance considerations." "But you're the director of the rehabilitation department," Madison countered, revealing her mother's professional standing in a way that made Sarah briefly close her eyes in recognition of where this was heading. "You told me directors get to try new things if they have good reasons." Dr. Winters looked at Sarah with new understanding. "You're the department director?" Sarah nodded, slightly uncomfortable with how the conversation was evolving. "Yes. For the past 3 years. And while Madison isn't wrong about my ability to propose innovative programs, there are still significant hurdles to what she's suggesting." Madison had turned her attention back to Atlas, who had remained attentive throughout the entire conversation, his amber eyes moving between speakers as though following the discussion. Despite his immobile hindquarters, his front legs maintained a dignified posture, and there was an undeniable alertness in his expression that contrasted with his physical limitation. "Look at his eyes," Madison said softly. "He understands what we're talking about. He knows." Both adults instinctively followed Madison's gaze, and in that moment of shared attention, Atlas's tail gave another deliberate thump against the concrete floor. The simple gesture, a universal canine signal of optimism and connection, created a palpable shift in the emotional atmosphere. Dr. Winters felt her clinical detachment wavering. In 15 years of shelter medicine, she had developed the necessary emotional barriers to make difficult decisions day after day. But occasionally, a case broke through those defenses, challenging her to remember why she had entered veterinary medicine in the first place. "Let me see him more closely," Sarah said suddenly, her professional curiosity now fully engaged. Dr. Winters hesitated only briefly before unlocking Atlas's kennel. As she opened the door, Atlas immediately attempted to drag himself forward. With his front legs, his desire for human connection overriding his physical limitations. Sarah knelt beside him, her trained hands moving with gentle expertise as she assessed his condition. She palpated his spine, checked muscle tone in all 4 limbs, and observed his responses to various stimuli, including a slight pressure on his rear paws. "There's a withdrawal reflex," she noted with interest. "Diminished, but present. That suggests incomplete spinal cord injury rather than complete transection." Dr. Winters moved closer, her own clinical interest rekindled. "You're right. We noted that in his initial exam, but without advanced imaging and specialist consultation, we couldn't justify more aggressive intervention." Sarah continued her improvised assessment, her years of neurological rehabilitation experience allowing her to recognize patterns and possibilities that transcended the human-animal divide. The fundamental principles of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize neural pathways and adapt following injury, applied across species with remarkable similarity. "His muscle mass has diminished, but isn't severely atrophied," Sarah observed. "How long did you say he's been paralyzed?" "Approximately 3 to 4 weeks, based on his condition when he was found," Dr. Winters replied. Sarah gently manipulated Atlas's hind legs through passive range of motion exercises, her hands moving with the confident precision of someone who had performed such assessments thousands of times. Atlas remained calm throughout, occasionally turning to make eye contact with Madison, who had positioned herself near his head, whispering encouragement. "There's definitely potential here," Sarah finally stated, her professional assessment overriding her initial hesitation. "In a human patient with similar presentation, I would absolutely recommend an intensive rehabilitation protocol." Dr. Winters felt the weight of the decision before her. The euthanasia schedule in her hand represented the pragmatic reality of shelter medicine, difficult choices made necessary by limited resources and overwhelming need. Yet her veterinary training had been built on a foundation of healing and advocacy for animals who couldn't speak for themselves. What would that protocol look like? She asked, her tone shifting from skeptical to cautiously interested. Sarah thought for a moment, translating her human rehabilitation expertise to this unique scenario. Hydrotherapy would be the cornerstone. Initially passive movement in water to maintain joint mobility and prevent further muscle atrophy, progressing to active assisted movement as neural pathways potentially regenerate. Supplemented with electrical stimulation therapy, targeted strength training, and proprioceptive exercises. The detailed explanation carried the unmistakable authority of professional expertise, and Dr. Winters found herself nodding in recognition of a comprehensive approach that aligned with veterinary rehabilitation principles. "And you believe this could make a meaningful difference for Atlas?" she asked, her question directed not just at Sarah's professional knowledge, but at her honest assessment of possibilities. Sarah met her gaze directly. "In rehabilitation medicine, we learn to balance hope with realism. I can't promise that Atlas will walk normally again, but I can say with professional confidence that he deserves a chance to benefit from the same interventions we would offer a human patient with similar presentation." Madison, who had been following this exchange with intense concentration, added her own perspective with characteristic directness. Even if he never walks perfectly again, he could get better than he is now, and he'd have people who care about him instead of being alone. The simple wisdom in her statement struck both adults with surprising force. In their professional focus on optimal outcomes and resource allocation, they had momentarily lost sight of the equally valid goal of improved quality of life, regardless of whether complete recovery was achieved. Dr. Winters looked down at her clipboard, then at her watch. The afternoon was advancing toward Atlas's scheduled euthanasia time, requiring a decision that suddenly felt far more complex than the routine resource allocations she managed daily. "I need to make some calls," she said finally, her decision crystallizing in the face of this unexpected convergence of expertise, opportunity, and advocacy. This would require special approval from shelter management, and we'd need to formalize whatever arrangement we might develop. Hope bloomed on Madison's face with a brilliance that illuminated the otherwise sterile shelter corridor. "So Atlas gets to try? He gets a chance?" Dr. Winters allowed herself a cautious smile, the first genuine one she had felt in this challenging day. "Yes, Madison, I think Atlas deserves that chance." The administrative office of Willowbrook Animal Shelter bore little resemblance to the kennel areas that visitors typically saw, where the adoption floor featured cheerful posters of success stories and colorful paw prints painted along the walls. Director Michael Harrington's office was utilitarian and budget-conscious. A metal desk dominated the small space, covered with grant applications, donation records, and the endless paperwork that kept the municipal shelter operational despite chronic underfunding. Michael looked up from his computer as Dr. Winters entered, immediately noting her unusual expression. In the 8 years they had worked together, he had come to recognize Eleanor's carefully maintained professional demeanor, necessary armor for a veterinarian tasked with making daily life and death decisions. Today, something had clearly pierced that armor. "We need to discuss a case," Eleanor began, her tone more tentative than her typical direct reporting style. "The German Shepherd scheduled for euthanasia this afternoon." Michael glanced at his watch. "Atlas, right? What's the issue? Documentation problem?" Eleanor placed her clipboard on his desk, buying herself a moment to organize her thoughts. "No, the paperwork is in order, but I've encountered an unusual situation that I believe warrants reconsideration of his case." She proceeded to explain. The unexpected meeting with Madison and Sarah Taylor carefully outlining Sarah's professional qualifications and her preliminary assessment of Atlas's rehabilitation potential. Michael listened without interruption, his expression transitioning from initial impatience to guarded interest. "So, you're telling me that the head of neurological rehabilitation at Mapleton Regional, who happened to walk into our shelter today with her daughter, believes this dog might walk again with specialized therapy?" Michael summarized, his tone balanced between skepticism and intrigue. "That's correct," Eleanor confirmed, "and more significantly, she has access to rehabilitation equipment that could be adapted for canine therapy, equipment that would normally be far beyond our budgetary reach." Michael leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. As shelter director, he was ultimately responsible for balancing animal welfare with fiscal reality, a task that often forced difficult compromises. The shelter's limited budget could only stretch so far, and specialized rehabilitation for a single dog typically couldn't be justified when those same resources could help dozens of adoptable animals. "And what exactly is Ms. Taylor proposing?" he asked. "That we transfer Atlas to the hospital facility?" "No," Eleanor clarified. "She's suggesting a collaborative arrangement. Atlas would remain under our legal custody, but she would develop and implement a rehabilitation protocol using the hospital's facilities during off hours. She explained that the equipment sits unused during evenings and weekends." Michael frowned. "There are liability issues, Eleanor. Insurance concerns. If a shelter animal is injured during treatment at the hospital, she's already considered that," Eleanor interrupted, pulling a hastily written document from her clipboard. "She drafted this preliminary outline while I was arranging this meeting. It addresses the major liability and responsibility questions." Michael accepted the paper with a raised eyebrow, impressed despite his reservations. The document, though clearly written quickly, demonstrated professional thoroughness, outlining responsibility parameters, volunteer waivers, and proposed scheduling that would minimize institutional conflicts. "She drafted this just now?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "Sarah Taylor appears to be as efficient as she is qualified, and she seems genuinely motivated to help Atlas." Michael scanned the document again, his administration experience allowing him to quickly identify potential obstacles and solutions. This would require board approval for the formal partnership, but though he paused, an unexpected opportunity coming into focus. This could actually align with our community engagement initiative. The Willowbrook board had recently emphasized the need for innovative community partnerships to address the shelter's chronic resource limitations. A collaboration with Mapleton Regional Hospital, particularly one that cost the shelter nothing while potentially generating positive publicity, could serve as an ideal pilot program. "Where is Ms. Taylor now?" Michael asked. "In the visitor area with her daughter," Eleanor replied. "They've refused to leave until Atlas's situation is resolved." Michael's lips twitched in a suppressed smile, the daughter being the 8-year-old. "Who started all this?" Eleanor allowed herself a small smile in return. "Madison, yes, she's quite determined." "I'd like to meet them," Michael decided, standing up. "And I want to see this dog that's caused such an unexpected disruption to our protocols." 10 minutes later, Michael found himself standing before Atlas's kennel, observing the German shepherd with new attention. Despite his paralyzed hindquarters, the dog maintained a dignified alertness, his intelligent eyes following the conversation around him. Madison sat cross-legged on the floor beside the open kennel door, one hand resting gently on Atlas's head. "He was somebody's dog before," Madison was explaining earnestly to Michael. "He knows commands and everything. Watch, Atlas, sit up." Despite his physical limitations, Atlas immediately raised his upper body into a modified sitting position. Using his powerful front legs, his gaze fixed attentively on Madison, as though eager to please despite his disability. "Good boy," Madison praised, offering a small treat from a packet Dr. Winters had provided. She looked up at Michael with transparent hopefulness. "See? He's smart and he tries really hard. He just needs his back legs to remember how to work." Michael turned to Sarah, who had been explaining her proposed rehabilitation approach in more detail to Dr. Winters. "Ms. Taylor, I appreciate your willingness to get involved, but I need to understand your motivation here. This would require a significant commitment of your personal time and professional expertise. Why Atlas specifically?" Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "Professionally, I see a case with genuine rehabilitation potential that aligns with my clinical expertise. The parallels between canine and human neurological recovery are substantial enough that this case interests me scientifically." She paused, glancing at her daughter. "But honestly, it's also because Madison sees something in him that resonates with the core of why I entered rehabilitation medicine in the first place. The belief that giving up on recovery should never be our first response to injury." Michael nodded, recognizing the authentic conviction in her answer. He turned back to Atlas, who maintained his sitting position despite the visible effort it required. There was something undeniably compelling about the dog's quiet determination. "We would need to formalize this arrangement properly," Michael said, his decision taking shape. "A written agreement outlining responsibilities, liability parameters, progress assessment protocols, and a defined timeline for re-evaluation." Madison looked up with widening eyes. "Does that mean Atlas gets to stay?" Michael smiled at her directness. "It means we're going to try something unprecedented, Madison. A special rehabilitation program that gives Atlas the chance your mother believes he deserves." The joy that transformed Madison's face created a moment of unexpected emotion for everyone present, a reminder of the pure, uncomplicated compassion that children could bring to situations adults approached with cautious complexity. "When can we start?" Madison asked eagerly. Sarah placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "If we're going to do this properly, there are preparations to make. I'll need to consult with veterinary rehabilitation specialists, adapt our equipment protocols for canine patients, and arrange the after-hours access." Dr. Winters, who had been observing this exchange with growing optimism, offered a practical suggestion. "Our standard procedure would be to transfer Atlas to foster care during rehabilitation. Given the specialized nature of his needs, would you consider serving as his foster family, Ms. Taylor? The shelter would provide basic supplies and veterinary oversight, while you would manage his daily care and rehabilitation." The question created a momentary hesitation in Sarah's confident demeanor. She had entered the shelter that rainy afternoon as a parent accompanying her animal-loving child, not expecting to potentially welcome a paralyzed German shepherd into their home. The practical implications, the responsibility, the time commitment, the adjustments to their living arrangements suddenly came into sharp focus. "Please, Mom," Madison whispered, though everyone present could hear her plea. "He needs us." Sarah looked at Atlas, who returned her gaze with a steadiness that seemed to communicate understanding beyond language. In her years as a rehabilitation specialist, she had learned to recognize the difficult-to-define quality that often predicted successful recovery, a particular kind of patient determination that transcended physical limitations. Something in Atlas's unwavering gaze spoke to that clinical intuition. Yes, she decided, her professional and personal instincts aligning. We can foster him during the rehabilitation process. Our backyard is already fenced, and I can convert the home office into a suitable space for him. Dr. Winters nodded with approval. I'll prepare the foster care agreement and gather supplies for you. Given Atlas's condition, you'll need specialized Items: a support harness for mobility assistance, protective booties for his rear paws to prevent dragging injuries, washable bedding. As the professionals discussed logistics, Madison had returned her attention to Atlas, leaning close to whisper in his ear. Michael, standing nearby, caught fragments of her one-sided conversation. "Going to come home with us. Learn to walk again. Have to be brave." The simple, hopeful promises of a child to a dog who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of the situation he was in, yet somehow seemed to grasp that something important had changed in his circumstances. By late afternoon, the rain had finally stopped, though the skies remained heavy with lingering clouds. The Willowbrook parking lot gleamed with puddles, reflecting the emerging patches of blue sky, as Sarah carefully arranged blankets in the back of her SUV, creating a comfortable space for Atlas's transport. Dr. Winters and a veterinary technician gently carried the German Shepherd from the shelter to the vehicle, using a specialized stretcher that supported his entire body. Madison climbed into the back seat beside Atlas, immediately placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to be scared," she told him earnestly. "New places are always a little scary at first, but you're going to love our house. There's a big yard with squirrels to watch and soft grass for when you're learning to walk again." From the driver's seat, Sarah watched this one-sided conversation in the rearview mirror, a mixture of emotions crossing her face. Concern about the responsibility they were undertaking, professional interest in the rehabilitation challenge, and unmistakable warmth at her daughter's compassionate determination. Dr. Winters leaned through the driver's side window, handing Sarah a folder of documentation and care instructions. "I've included my personal cell number," she said. "Call any time, day or night, if you have concerns, and I've scheduled a home visit for Friday to check on his adjustment and discuss the rehabilitation plan in more detail." Sarah accepted the folder with a nod of appreciation. "Thank you for giving him this chance." Eleanor glanced at Atlas in the back seat, then back to Sarah. "I think we all needed the reminder that sometimes our protocols need to be flexible enough to accommodate unexpected possibilities." She smiled slightly. "And determined 8-year-olds." As the SUV pulled away from Willowbrook Animal Shelter, no one present could have predicted exactly how this unprecedented arrangement would unfold. But something remarkable had already occurred. A convergence of compassion, expertise, and institutional flexibility that had transformed a scheduled euthanasia into an innovative rehabilitation opportunity. In the back seat, Madison had begun, telling Atlas about his new home and the adventures that awaited him, her voice carrying the absolute certainty that only children can maintain in the face of daunting challenges. And Atlas, his head resting on his front paws, watched the changing landscape through the window with alert interest. A dog whose story was no longer ending, but beginning a new and unexpected chapter. The Taylor home, a modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street, had undergone a remarkable transformation in just 24 hours. Sarah's living room, once arranged for aesthetic comfort, now featured a specialized orthopedic dog bed positioned to allow Atlas to observe both the family's activities and the front window's view of the neighborhood. The dining room had been reorganized to accommodate a low table covered with veterinary supplies, rehabilitation equipment, and the meticulously organized binder of tracking sheets that Sarah had created to monitor Atlas's progress. Most striking was the conversion of the home office into what Madison had enthusiastically dubbed Atlas's therapy room. The desk and filing cabinets had been pushed against the walls, creating an open space in the center where Sarah had laid interlocking foam exercise mats. A specially ordered canine support harness hung from a reinforced ceiling hook, a temporary solution until the proper ceiling track system she had ordered would arrive. Dr. Eleanor. Winters surveyed these modifications with professional appreciation during her first home visit, 48 hours after Atlas had left the shelter. "I'm impressed with how quickly you've adapted your space," she commented, making notes on her clipboard. "Most foster families take considerably longer to establish appropriate accommodations." Sarah smiled tiredly, the faint shadows under her eyes revealing the intensive effort behind these changes. The rehabilitation department staff were incredibly supportive. Several of them came over yesterday evening to help move furniture and install the ceiling support. They're fascinated by the cross-species application of our therapeutic approaches. Madison, who had appointed herself Atlas's official companion, sat beside the German Shepherd on his orthopedic bed, carefully brushing his coat with long, gentle strokes. The grooming session served multiple purposes, improving Atlas's appearance after weeks of minimal maintenance at the shelter, stimulating his skin and circulation, and perhaps most importantly, establishing the bond of trust essential for the challenging rehabilitation process ahead. "His coat is getting shinier already," Madison observed, her focus entirely on her task. "And Mom says that's good, because it means his body is getting proper nutrition now." Dr. Winters knelt beside Atlas, conducting a thorough physical assessment. She palpated his spine, checked joint mobility in all 4 limbs, and tested various neurological reflexes, her experienced hands moving with gentle precision. Atlas remained calm throughout the examination, his amber eyes occasionally seeking Madison's reassurance. "His muscle tone has already improved slightly," Dr. Winters noted with surprise. "Have you started any rehabilitation exercises yet?" Sarah nodded, retrieving her documentation binder from the dining room table. "We began with passive range of motion exercises yesterday, 3 sessions of 20 repetitions for each joint in the hindquarters." She opened the binder to reveal detailed notes, including measurements of joint angles and observations of Atlas's responses. "I've also implemented gentle massage techniques to improve circulation and reduce muscle atrophy." Dr. Winters raised an eyebrow, impressed by the professional thoroughness of Sarah's approach. "This documentation would satisfy the most demanding veterinary rehabilitation specialist. You've essentially established a clinical-grade protocol in your home. The principles are remarkably similar to human neurological rehabilitation," Sarah explained. "Modified for canine anatomy, of course, but the fundamental approaches to stimulating neuroplasticity remain consistent across species." Madison looked up from her grooming duties. "Mom says Atlas's brain needs to find new pathways to talk to his back legs since the old ones got damaged." Dr. Winters smiled at this simplified but accurate description of neurological recovery. "That's exactly right, Madison. And consistent, appropriate stimulation is how we encourage those new pathways to form." "When can we start the water therapy?" Madison asked eagerly. "That's going to help him the most, right?" Sarah exchanged a glance with Dr. Winters. "The hospital administrator has approved our use of the hydrotherapy equipment during weekend off hours. We're scheduled for our first session this Saturday morning." Dr. Winters made additional notes on her clipboard. "Hydrotherapy often produces the most visible progress in cases like this. The water's buoyancy allows for movement patterns that might be impossible on land, while providing just enough resistance to strengthen recovering neural pathways." Madison set aside the grooming brush and gently stroked Atlas's head. "Did you hear that, Atlas? On Saturday, you're going swimming. That's the first big step to walking again." Atlas responded with an alert expression, his ears perking forward at Madison's excited tone. Over just 2 days, he had already begun to show noticeable improvements in his general condition. His coat appeared healthier, his eyes brighter, and most encouragingly, he had started attempting to adjust his hindquarters position, using his core muscles, something he hadn't demonstrated at the shelter. I've been researching similar cases in veterinary literature, Sarah said, retrieving several printed journal articles from her binder. Recovery statistics vary significantly based on the exact nature of the spinal cord damage, but there are documented cases of dogs with comparable injuries regaining partial or even substantial mobility with intensive rehabilitation. Dr. Winters accepted the articles with interest. I'm familiar with some of these studies, but several are more recent than my last continuing education course in rehabilitation medicine. This one, she indicated a paper from a veterinary neurology journal, reports significantly better outcomes than we typically expect in shelter medicine practice. That's because most shelters can't provide specialized rehabilitation, Sarah pointed out. The standard protocol for assessment assumes limited intervention capabilities. The observation wasn't critical but factual, highlighting the systemic constraints that had initially placed Atlas on the euthanasia schedule. Dr. Winters nodded in acknowledgement, recognizing the truth in Sarah's statement. That's exactly why this collaboration is so valuable, she agreed. You're providing expertise and resources that would otherwise be inaccessible to shelter animals. Madison, who had been listening carefully to the adults' conversation, offered her own perspective with characteristic directness. Atlas just needed someone to believe he could get better. Sometimes that's the most important medicine. The simple wisdom in her statement created a moment of reflection for both professionals. In their evidence-based fields, quantifiable measurements and documented protocols formed the foundation of practice. Yet both had witnessed cases where recovery defied statistical probability, where a patient's determination, combined with unwavering support, produced results that exceeded medical expectations. Speaking of believing, Sarah said, I think it's time for Atlas's standing practice. Madison immediately shifted into what she called her therapy assistant role, moving to Atlas's front, while Sarah positioned herself beside his hindquarters. With practice coordination that suggested they had rehearsed this maneuver multiple times already, Sarah gently supported Atlas's hindquarters using the specialized harness, while Madison provided encouraging verbal cues. Up, Atlas! You can do it! Madison encouraged, her voice conveying absolute confidence. Atlas responded with visible effort, his powerful front legs pushing against the floor, while Sarah provided just enough support to his hindquarters to make the task challenging, but achievable. For 30 seconds, he maintained a modified standing position, his rear legs not fully supporting his weight, but nonetheless positioned correctly beneath him, rather than splayed uselessly to the side. Dr. Winters observed with clinical interest, noting the coordinated engagement of muscle groups that suggested neural pathways might indeed be beginning to re-establish. That's remarkable progress for just 48 hours, she commented. He wasn't able to achieve that positioning at the shelter even with assistance. Sarah carefully lowered Atlas back to a resting position, praising him with professional warmth. We've been practicing this 3 times daily. Each session, his core engagement improves slightly, and the trembling in his hindquarters decreases. It's subtle, but measurable. Dr. Winters completed her examination notes, her clinical assessment evolving as she witnessed this structured approach to Atlas's rehabilitation. What had initially seemed like a well-intentioned but perhaps overly optimistic intervention now presented as a legitimate therapeutic protocol with measurable parameters and reasonable goals. I'd like to formalize this as an official shelter pilot program, she decided, looking up from her clipboard. With your permission, I'd like to document Atlas's rehabilitation process comprehensively, including video records of assessment, sessions, and detailed progress notes. This could establish a protocol for similar cases in the future. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I've already discussed this possibility with my department. Several of my colleagues have expressed interest in contributing their expertise to developing standardized approaches for canine neurological rehabilitation. We could potentially establish guidelines that other shelters could implement, even with limited resources. The conversation had shifted from the specific case of one paralyzed German Shepherd to the broader implications for shelter medicine and animal welfare. A transition that reflected how innovative solutions often emerged from individual acts of compassion. Madison, meanwhile, had returned to Atlas's side, her small hand resting on his shoulder as she spoke softly in his ear. The bond developing between them transcended the clinical aspects of rehabilitation, creating the emotional foundation that often proved as important to recovery as any physical therapy technique. "I've brought the specialized booties we discussed," Dr. Winters said, removing a package from her medical bag. "These will protect his rear paws from abrasions when you begin mobility training with the support harness." Sarah accepted the booties with appreciation. "Perfect timing. We're scheduled to progress to supported walking attempts tomorrow, once he's mastered the standing position." Dr. Winters watched as Madison demonstrated for Atlas how the booties would fit on his paws, holding one up for his inspection as she explained their purpose with the natural teaching instinct of a child who assumed her canine companion understood every word. Despite the seriousness of his condition, Atlas's attention remained focused on Madison, his expression alert and engaged. "I've seen many animals in rehabilitation settings," Dr. Winters observed quietly to Sarah, "but rarely have I witnessed such a perfect match between patient and advocate. Madison has a remarkable ability to engage him." Sarah smiled with maternal pride, tinged with thoughtfulness. She's always had a special connection with animals, but with Atlas, it's different. More focused. She talks about his recovery with absolute certainty, not hope or wishful thinking, but genuine conviction. As if illustrating her mother's point, Madison was now demonstrating to Atlas how he would eventually walk again, moving her own legs in exaggerated steps while supporting herself against the wall. "See, first one leg, then the other. Your brain just needs to remember the pattern." Dr. Winters completed her final notes, her professional assessment now documented alongside observations that couldn't be quantified in medical terminology, the intangible elements of connection, determination, and unwavering support that sometimes proved as crucial to recovery as any clinical intervention. "I'll return next week to assess progress after the initial hydrotherapy session," she said, packing her medical bag. "But please call me immediately if you observe any concerning changes." As Dr. Winters prepared to leave, Madison approached her with sudden seriousness. "Dr. Eleanor," she said, using the veterinarian's first name with the casual familiarity children often adopt, "can you bring your special camera next time? The one that takes videos?" "My assessment camera, yes, of course," Dr. Winters replied. "Why do you ask?" Madison's expression brightened with confidence. "Because I think Atlas is going to show you something amazing next time, and we should record it for your pilot program." The absolute certainty in her voice, free from the cautious qualifications adults learn to apply to uncertain outcomes, created another moment of reflection for the professionals present. In their evidence-based fields, they had been trained to moderate expectations, to prepare for limited outcomes, to find value in incremental improvements. Yet as Dr. Winters looked at Atlas, now attempting to adjust his position to maintain visual contact with Madison as she moved around the room, she found herself surprisingly receptive to the possibility that this case might indeed yield something beyond standard expectations. "I'll bring the camera," she promised, recognizing that documentation would be valuable regardless of the outcome. "And I look forward to seeing Atlas's progress." As she drove away from the Taylor home, Dr. Winters found herself contemplating how a rainy Tuesday afternoon and a chance encounter had cascaded into this unprecedented situation. A municipal shelter, collaborating with a hospital rehabilitation department. A paralyzed dog receiving specialized therapy that would normally be reserved for human patients. And an 8-year-old girl whose unwavering belief had set this entire process in motion. In her 15 years of shelter medicine, she had learned to focus on the animals she could help within the constraints of limited resources. Yet here was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most significant advances came not from accepting limitations, but from reimagining what might be possible when compassion aligned with expertise and opportunity. Saturday morning arrived with golden sunshine streaming through the windows of Mapleton Regional Hospital's rehabilitation wing. The facility, typically bustling with patients during weekdays, stood quiet and empty, except for the small group gathered at the hydrotherapy pool. Sarah had arranged special access for Atlas's first aquatic therapy session, coordinating with hospital administration and security to ensure everything proceeded according to protocol. The rehabilitation pool occupied a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a landscaped courtyard. Designed for human patients with mobility limitations, the rectangular pool featured a gradual entry ramp, parallel bars mounted along the sides, and a specialized lift system for patients unable to enter independently. The water gleamed turquoise under the overhead lights, maintained at a therapeutic 92 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to relax muscles and increase circulation without overheating during exercise. Madison pressed her face against the glass door, watching with fascination as Sarah and 2 of her professional colleagues made final preparations inside. She wore the official therapy assistant T-shirt her mother had specially ordered, white, with blue lettering that matched the hospital's color scheme. At her side, Atlas remained calm in his specialized transport wheelchair, a donated device from the hospital's equipment surplus that Sarah had modified for canine proportions. "Are you excited, Atlas?" Madison whispered, kneeling beside him. "This is how you're going to remember how to walk. The water will help you float, and your legs can practice the movements without having to hold all your weight." Atlas responded with alert attention, his amber eyes focused on Madison's face. Over the past 3 days, he had shown increasingly responsive engagement during their therapy sessions at home, particularly when Madison participated as Sarah's assistant. His ability to maintain a supported standing position had improved measurably, progressing from 30 seconds to nearly 2 minutes before fatigue set in. Dr. Winters arrived, camera equipment in hand, and greeted Madison with professional warmth. "Good morning, therapy assistant Taylor. I see your patient is ready for his hydrotherapy assessment." Madison beamed at this acknowledgement of her role. "We practiced with the special life vest at home yesterday, so he'd be used to wearing it. And we showed him videos of dogs swimming, so he'd know what to expect." Dr. Winters smiled at this thoughtful preparation. In her years of veterinary practice, she had learned that success often depended on these seemingly small details. The careful introduction to new experiences, the establishment of trust before attempting challenging procedures. Madison's intuitive understanding of these principles continued to impress her. Sarah emerged from the pool area, dressed in quick-dry athletic wear suitable for entering the water with her patient. "We're ready," she announced. "Dr. Larson and Vanessa will assist with the first session. They've both worked with rehabilitation patients who have spinal cord injuries, and they're eager to help adapt our techniques for Atlas." Dr. Patricia Larson, the hospital's lead physical therapist specializing in neurological recovery, and Vanessa Chen, an occupational therapist with additional certification in aquatic therapy, followed Sarah into the hallway. Both wore the same focused expression that Sarah recognized from challenging human cases, professional curiosity combined with determination to solve a complex rehabilitation puzzle. The lift system is calibrated for Atlas's weight, Dr. Larson explained, gesturing toward the mechanical apparatus that would lower the German Shepherd safely into the water. We've modified a harness designed for pediatric patients. It should provide optimal support while allowing us to assess his natural movement patterns in the water. Vanessa knelt beside Atlas, allowing him to become comfortable with her presence, before gently examining his hindquarters. His muscle tone has definitely improved since you began the home exercises, she observed. The atrophy is less pronounced than I expected based on the case notes. Dr. Winters set up her camera equipment on a tripod at the pool's edge, positioning it to capture Atlas's movements from multiple angles. The shelter board is particularly interested in documenting this phase of rehabilitation. Hydrotherapy equipment is beyond most shelter budgets, but if we can demonstrate significant results, it might justify grant applications for similar programs. Sarah nodded in understanding. The hospital administration is equally interested. There's growing research on the benefits of animal-assisted therapy for human patients, but this reverse application, using human rehabilitation techniques, for animals could open new collaborative possibilities. The conversation highlighted how Atlas's case had evolved beyond one dog's recovery story to represent potential systemic innovation, a bridge between veterinary and human medical approaches that might benefit countless animals in similar situations. Madison, however, remained focused entirely on Atlas himself. Can we start now? Atlas is ready to swim. The adults exchanged smiles at her directness before Sarah nodded. Yes, it's time. Madison, remember what we practiced. You'll stand with me at the ramp entry where Atlas can see you clearly. Your job is to provide encouragement and help him stay calm while we work on the exercises. With careful coordination, the team transferred Atlas from his wheelchair to the specialized lift system. The German Shepherd remained remarkably composed throughout the process, his eyes frequently seeking Madison, who maintained a steady stream of reassuring commentary. The harness feels funny, but it's going to help you float, she explained, as the adults secured the supportive device around Atlas's body. And the water is nice and warm, like a bath but bigger. You're being so brave, Atlas. Once secured in the lift harness, Atlas was slowly positioned over the water. Dr. Winters began recording as the mechanical system gently lowered him into the pool where Sarah and Dr. Larson waited, already standing waist-deep in the therapeutic water. Vanessa guided Madison to her position at the ramp entry, where she could maintain eye contact with Atlas throughout the session. The moment Atlas's paws touched the water, a visible change came over him. Rather than showing anxiety at this new sensation, his expression registered what appeared to be recognition, perhaps accessing some cellular memory of instinctive swimming ability that predated his injury. As his body became partially buoyant, supported by both the water and the harness, his tail gave a deliberate swish, the most substantial voluntary movement of his hindquarters observed since his arrival at the Taylor home. "Did you see that?" Madison exclaimed, her voice echoing in the tiled room. "His tail moved in the water." Sarah and Dr. Larson exchanged meaningful glances, both recognizing the significance of this response. Dr. Winters zoomed her camera to capture the movement, while Vanessa made notes on a waterproof tablet. "Let's begin with passive range of motion while he acclimates to the environment," Sarah suggested, her professional voice steady despite her obvious excitement at Atlas's response. For the next 15 minutes, the rehabilitation specialists worked in practiced coordination, supporting Atlas in the water while gently moving his rear legs through swimming motions. The buoyancy of the water removed the gravitational constraints that limited his movement on land, allowing his joints to move through fuller ranges of motion with minimal resistance. Throughout this initial phase, Atlas remained attentive and engaged, his eyes frequently finding Madison at the pool's edge as though drawing confidence from her presence. The water seemed to awaken something in him, a remembrance of movement patterns that his injured nervous system had temporarily forgotten. "I think he's ready to attempt some active movement, Doctor," Larson suggested, noting the increasing muscle engagement as they progressed through the passive exercises. "Let's reduce the support slightly and see if he initiates any independent motion." Sarah nodded agreement, and together they adjusted the harness to provide less complete support while still ensuring Atlas remained safely buoyant. With this modification, his hindquarters sank slightly lower in the water, requiring more active participation to maintain optimal positioning. "Atlas, kick your back legs," Madison called encouragingly from her position. "Like this," she demonstrated, an exaggerated kicking motion with her own legs, the universal language of body movement transcending the species barrier. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. Atlas, his attention fixed on Madison's demonstration, initiated a distinct paddling motion with his right hind leg, weak and uncoordinated, but unmistakably voluntary. After several seconds, the left leg joined in a hesitant, asymmetrical pattern that nonetheless represented the first bilateral movement he had shown since his injury. The room fell momentarily silent as the significance of this development registered with all present. In neurological rehabilitation, these initial movements, however tentative, often represented the critical breakthrough that preceded more substantial recovery. The neural pathways were not destroyed, but damaged, capable of re-establishing connection with appropriate stimulation and support. Dr. Winters zoomed her camera to capture this crucial moment, while Vanessa made rapid notes on her tablet. Time. To first bilateral movement, 16 minutes into initial hydrotherapy session, she documented. Patient demonstrates asymmetrical but voluntary kicking pattern in response to visual cueing. Sarah maintained her professional composure, supporting Atlas in the water, while providing gentle tactile guidance to reinforce the movement pattern. But her eyes, meeting Madison's across the pool, reflected the emotional significance beneath the clinical achievement. This wasn't just a promising therapeutic indication, it was the first tangible evidence supporting Madison's unwavering belief in Atlas's potential for recovery. "Good boy, Atlas," Madison called, her voice ringing with excitement. "You're swimming!" The simple praise seemed to energize Atlas, who continued his halting paddling motion for nearly 30 seconds before fatigue set in. Even as the movement subsided, the breakthrough had been established. His nervous system had demonstrated its capacity for reorganization, for finding alternative pathways to activate muscles previously unresponsive. "Let's end this first session on this success," Dr. Larson suggested, her experienced judgment recognizing the importance of avoiding overexertion during initial rehabilitation. 15 minutes is appropriate for a first exposure, and he's already shown remarkable progress. Sarah agreed, and they carefully guided Atlas toward the ramp where Madison waited. As they reached the shallow end, Sarah provided supportive guidance while allowing Atlas's paws to make contact with the ramp surface, creating an opportunity to experience the transition from swimming to weight-bearing in the water's supportive environment. To everyone's surprise, Atlas attempted a deliberate forward movement along the ramp, his front legs walking normally, while his hind legs made uncoordinated but purposeful motions to support partial weight. The water's buoyancy reduced the gravitational demands enough that his weakened hindquarters could participate in this rudimentary walking pattern for several steps before his strength gave out. "He's walking in the water!" Madison exclaimed, dropping to her knees at the ramp's edge to be at Atlas's eye level as he emerged. "Did you see that? His back legs are remembering." Dr. Winters captured this moment as well, her camera documenting not just Atlas's physical progress, but Madison's radiant expression, the embodiment of the hope and determination that had initiated this entire process. This footage would provide compelling visual evidence for the shelter board, demonstrating outcomes that statistical reports alone could never convey. As they carefully transferred Atlas from the pool to a waiting, towel-covered stretcher, the adults exchanged glances that communicated their shared professional assessment. The session had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Atlas had demonstrated neurological capacity that suggested substantial recovery might indeed be possible with continued intensive rehabilitation. "What do you think?" Sarah asked Dr. Larson quietly as they dried Atlas with warm towels, mindful of Madison's attentive presence. Dr. Larson maintained the measured response of an experienced rehabilitation specialist, neither dismissive of promising indicators nor overcommitting to specific outcomes. The bilateral movement and weight-bearing attempts are extremely encouraging first-session responses. The neural pathways are clearly not completely severed. With consistent hydrotherapy and your home protocol, I would anticipate continued improvement, though the extent remains to be determined. This carefully calibrated assessment, hopeful but realistic, reflected the balanced approach that experienced medical professionals maintained. But Madison, overhearing this exchange, offered her own unfiltered perspective. "Atlas is going to walk again," she stated with absolute conviction. "Maybe not exactly like before, but he's going to walk. He just showed us he remembers how." The simple certainty in her declaration created another moment of reflection for the professionals present. In their evidence-based practices, they had learned to qualify predictions, to prepare patients and families for ranges of possible outcomes rather than specific guarantees. Yet Madison's unwavering belief, now supported by Atlas's promising initial response, carried its own kind of wisdom, the recognition that recovery often began with the absolute rejection of limitation as a foregone conclusion. As they prepared to transport Atlas back to the Taylor home, Dr. Winters approached Madison with her camera, reviewing some of the footage she had captured. "Would you like to see Atlas's first swimming session?" she offered, turning the camera's display screen toward Madison. Madison watched the recorded moments with intense focus, her expression brightening as the footage showed Atlas's initial kicking motions and his attempts to walk on the submerged ramp. "Can we show this to the people at the shelter?" she asked, "so they can see that Atlas deserved his chance?" The question carried layers of meaning beyond its simple wording, a child's understanding that systems and institutions sometimes needed visible evidence to justify compassionate exceptions to established protocols. "That's exactly why I recorded it," Dr. Winters confirmed. "This footage will help the shelter board understand the value of rehabilitation in cases like Atlas's. It might help other dogs like him in the future." Madison nodded with satisfaction, returning her attention to Atlas, who rested comfortably on his towel-covered stretcher, visibly tired but alert. "Did you hear that, Atlas? You're helping other dogs too. You're a pioneer." The word pioneer, surprisingly sophisticated from an 8-year-old, captured precisely what Atlas had become in this unprecedented collaboration between a municipal animal shelter and a human medical facility. His case represented not just one dog's journey toward recovery, but the exploration of new territory in cross-disciplinary rehabilitation approaches. As Atlas was carefully loaded into the Taylor's vehicle for the journey home, the team agreed to schedule twice-weekly hydrotherapy sessions alongside the daily home protocol. The intensive schedule would require significant commitment from everyone involved, But Atlas's promising response had reinforced their collective determination. "Rest today, buddy," Sarah told Atlas as she secured his transportation harness. "Your muscles have worked harder than they have in weeks. Tomorrow we'll start integrating what you learned in the water into our land-based exercises." Madison settled into the seat beside Atlas, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "I knew you could do it," she whispered. "I just knew it." And in that moment of quiet confidence between a determined child and a dog defying medical expectations, the essence of their remarkable journey was distilled to its purest form. The transformative power of unwavering belief when aligned with expertise, opportunity, and the innate resilience of life seeking to heal. 2 weeks after Atlas's first hydrotherapy session, Sarah Taylor's living room had transformed into an impromptu conference space. Medical journals and rehabilitation textbooks covered the coffee table, while a whiteboard displayed a detailed tracking chart of Atlas's progress. 3 physical therapists from Mapleton Regional's rehabilitation department sat on the couch, reviewing footage from Atlas's most recent therapy session on a laptop. The atmosphere carried the focused energy of medical professionals confronting a challenging but promising case, the kind that demanded innovative approaches and cross-disciplinary collaboration. Conversations flowed with the specialized terminology of rehabilitation medicine, occasionally punctuated by exclamations when reviewing particularly significant moments in Atlas's recovery journey. "The asymmetrical gait pattern is gradually normalizing," observed Dr. Patricia Larson, pausing the video to indicate Atlas's movement in the hydrotherapy pool. "Compare this to the footage from last week. The right hind leg is now initiating the stride sequence with greater consistency." Vanessa Chen nodded, making notes in her tablet. "The proprioceptive awareness has improved substantially. He's demonstrating conscious paw placement rather than the reflexive movement we saw initially." Through the patio doors, Atlas could be seen in the backyard, wearing his supportive harness connected to a mobile overhead track that Sarah had installed along the fence line. The system allowed him to practice weight-bearing walking attempts with appropriate support, preventing falls while encouraging increasing independence. Madison walked alongside him in her therapy assistant t-shirt, now complemented by a makeshift badge she had created from a hospital visitor sticker. Her expression showed intense concentration as she monitored Atlas's movements, occasionally adjusting the support harness or offering encouraging words when he successfully completed a sequence of steps. "The home setup you've created is remarkable," commented Dr. James Wilson, the rehabilitation department's neurological specialist who had joined the team after seeing Atlas's initial hydrotherapy results. "This parallel track system would benefit many of our human patients transitioning from aquatic to land-based therapy." Sarah smiled, recognizing the irony. "It's adapted from the pediatric rehabilitation model we use for children learning to walk after spinal injuries. We've essentially come full circle. Techniques developed for humans, inspired by observing natural movement patterns in animals, now being reapplied to animal rehabilitation." Dr. Winters, who had been quietly observing the professional discussion, while updating her documentation for the shelter board, reflected on how dramatically the project had evolved in just 17 days. What had begun as a compassionate exception for one shelter dog had developed into a formal research initiative with proper protocols, consistent documentation, and measurable outcomes that might eventually be publishable in veterinary journals. "The shelter board reviews our progress report tomorrow," she mentioned during a pause in the technical discussion. "They've already expressed interest in developing a permanent partnership with the hospital for similar cases in the future. The timing works well with our community engagement initiative," Dr. Larson noted. The hospital administration is increasingly focused on demonstrating broader social impact beyond traditional patient care. The conversation continued in this vein, professionals identifying the institutional benefits and potential programmatic developments emerging from their collaboration. Yet amidst these discussions of protocols and partnerships, the central reality remained the German shepherd in the backyard, determinedly placing one paw in front of another with his 8-year-old guide beside him. Sarah noticed Dr. Winters, watching Madison and Atlas through the window. She's missed most of her summer vacation activities to focus on his rehabilitation, she commented quietly. Her swimming lessons, the community theater program she loves, she insisted on postponing. Everything, said Atlas's recovery was more important right now. Doctor. Winters nodded thoughtfully. I've worked with many dedicated pet owners over the years, but Madison's commitment is extraordinary, especially for someone so young. It worries me sometimes, Sarah admitted. The intensity of her involvement, the absolute certainty she maintains about his full recovery. I've tried to have age-appropriate conversations about realistic expectations, but she sees possibilities where adults have learned to see limitations. Dr. Winters completed the thought. Perhaps that's exactly what Atlas needed. Their attention was drawn to a sudden commotion in the backyard. Madison was calling excitedly, waving toward the house. Through the patio doors, they could see Atlas standing with minimal support from the harness, maintaining his balance for what appeared to be a sustained period. The professionals immediately moved toward the doors, their clinical interest engaged by this apparent development. As they stepped into the backyard, Madison's excitement became clear. "Mom, Dr. Eleanor, he's standing on his own," she announced triumphantly, carefully reducing the harness support to demonstrate. "Watch." With the support harness providing only minimal stabilization, Atlas maintained a standing position, his hindquarters visibly engaged in supporting a significant portion of his weight. His back legs trembled slightly with the effort, but they remained positioned correctly beneath him, rather than splaying or collapsing. "How long has he been able to do this?" Dr. Larson asked, immediately shifting into assessment mode. "Just now," Madison explained, her words tumbling out rapidly. "We were practicing our walking and he stopped to look at a squirrel on the fence. I noticed the harness wasn't taking his weight anymore. He was standing by himself." The professionals exchanged significant glances, recognizing the milestone this represented. Independent standing, even for brief periods, indicated substantial neurological recovery, with motor pathways re-establishing sufficient connection to maintain anti-gravity muscle activation. Dr. Wilson moved closer to observe Atlas's positioning. The weight distribution appears remarkably symmetrical considering the asymmetrical pattern of his initial recovery. "May I?" he asked Madison, gesturing toward Atlas. Madison nodded permission, maintaining a reassuring hand on Atlas's shoulder. As Dr. Wilson conducted a brief standing assessment, he gently tested the strength of Atlas's stance by applying minimal pressure to different points, evaluating the compensatory responses. "There's purposeful weight shifting," he noted with professional interest. "He's making active postural adjustments to maintain balance, not just locking his joints." Sarah had retrieved her documentation binder and was recording this significant development, including the precise date, time, and circumstances. "This aligns with the progression we've observed in the hydrotherapy sessions," she noted. His underwater weight-bearing capacity increased substantially during Tuesday's session. Dr. Winters had automatically reached for her camera, capturing video documentation of this milestone for the shelterboard presentation. The footage would provide compelling visual evidence of Atlas's progress, far more persuasive than written reports or statistical measurements alone. "Can he try walking without the full harness support?" Vanessa suggested. perhaps with just the stabilizing handles for balance assistance. Sarah considered this question with careful professional judgment. We don't want to risk injury from a fall at this stage. His bone density has likely decreased during the paralysis period, and a misstep could cause fractures. What about the partial support setting? Madison suggested, indicating an adjustment mechanism on the harness system. It still catches him if he falls, but doesn't hold his weight unless he needs it. The adults exchanged impressed glances at Madison's technical understanding of the equipment. In just 2 weeks, she had absorbed the rehabilitation principles and support systems with remarkable comprehension, applying them with the intuitive adaptability that children often brought to new learning. That's an excellent suggestion. Sarah agreed. The dynamic support setting would provide safety while encouraging independent movement. With careful adjustments to the system, Atlas was positioned for his first minimally supported walking attempt. The harness now provided a safety mechanism rather than constant support. It would engage only if his legs began to collapse, otherwise allowing him to bear his own weight and initiate movement patterns himself. "Go ahead, Atlas," Madison encouraged, positioning herself a few feet ahead of him. "You can do it. Walk to me." For several moments, Atlas remained stationary, perhaps assessing this new challenge. His amber eyes moved between Madison and the distance separating them, while his muscles visibly tensed as though preparing for the effort. The professionals observed silently, recognizing the importance of allowing him to initiate movement without pressure or interference. Then, with deliberate concentration, Atlas lifted his right front paw and placed it forward, followed by his left hind leg in the diagonal gait pattern natural to quadrupeds. The movement was tentative and unsteady, but the neurological coordination it represented was unmistakable. His left front paw followed, then the right hind leg, completing a full gait cycle that propelled him forward approximately 1 foot. Madison remained perfectly still, her expression a mixture of excitement and focused restraint, understanding instinctively that excessive reaction might distract Atlas from the intense concentration his effort required. Only when he had completed 3 consecutive steps, bringing him within reach of her outstretched hand, did she offer quiet praise. "You did it, Atlas," she whispered, dropping to her knees to meet his gaze at eye level. "You're walking again." The simplicity of her statement belied the profound achievement it represented. For Atlas, these 3 tentative steps marked the transition from paralysis to mobility, from dependence to the beginning of restored independence. For the rehabilitation team, they represented validation of their innovative cross-disciplinary approach and the effectiveness of their intensive therapeutic protocol. Dr. Winters continued recording, capturing not just Atlas's physical achievement, but Madison's response, the perfect balance of encouragement and restraint that characterized her remarkable intuition as a therapy assistant. This footage would communicate the emotional significance underlying the clinical progress, helping the shelter board understand the full dimension of what their approval had made possible. "Let's give him a rest now," Sarah suggested, noting signs of fatigue in Atlas's posture. 3 consecutive independent steps is a substantial neurological effort for a first attempt. We don't want to risk overexertion. Madison nodded agreement, immediately adjusting the harness to provide full support again, as Atlas was guided to his nearby rest area, a shaded portion of the patio equipped with his orthopedic bed and water bowl. The smooth transition demonstrated how thoroughly she had integrated the rehabilitation principles into her care routine, understanding the balanced rhythm of exertion and recovery essential for optimal neurological healing. As Atlas settled onto his bed, accepting Madison's reward treat with dignity, the professionals moved a short distance away to discuss the implications of what they had witnessed. "The rate of progress is remarkable," Dr. Wilson observed, keeping his voice low. 3 weeks ago, this dog was scheduled for euthanasia due to complete hind-end paralysis. Today, he demonstrated independent ambulation with functional gait patterning. The intensive protocol is clearly effective, Dr. Larson agreed. Particularly the combination of daily home exercises with specialized hydrotherapy. The aquatic environment seems to accelerate the neurological retraining process. Sarah nodded, though her expression remained measured with the caution of an experienced rehabilitation specialist. We should maintain perspective on what we're seeing. He's taken 3 assisted steps in a controlled environment. Full functional recovery would require independent mobility across varied surfaces and situations. Of course, Dr. Winters acknowledged, but even this level of improvement represents an outcome far beyond what would have been possible in a standard shelter environment. That's the significance for our institutional partnership. The conversation continued in this vein, measured professional assessments balanced with recognition of the genuinely promising developments they were witnessing. Yet throughout this clinical discussion, each of them periodically glanced toward Madison, who had settled beside Atlas's bed with a children's book, apparently reading him a story about woodland animals while he rested from his exertion. The contrast was striking. Sophisticated medical professionals analyzing neurological recovery patterns, while an 8-year-old simply provided companionship and encouragement to a dog learning to walk again. Yet increasingly, it seemed the child's approach contained wisdom the adults recognized as valuable, an uncluttered focus on possibility rather than limitation, on progress rather than prognosis. As the afternoon meeting concluded, Dr. Winters prepared to leave with her documentation and video footage for the shelter board presentation. At the door, she paused to speak privately with Sarah. "Whatever the ultimate outcome of Atlas's recovery," she said quietly, "I want you to know that this collaboration has already transformed how we approach special needs cases at Willowbrook. The shelter manager has approved funding for basic rehabilitation, equipment and staff training based on our preliminary reports alone." Sarah smiled, recognizing the significance of this institutional shift. "That's wonderful news. Rehabilitation doesn't require our level of specialized equipment to make meaningful differences for many animals. Even basic therapeutic approaches can significantly improve outcomes." Dr. Winters nodded agreement. "Exactly. And that's the broader impact emerging from Madison's refusal to accept that Atlas should be euthanized. One child's determination has initiated changes that may benefit countless animals in similar situations." As she drove away from the Taylor home, Dr. Winters reflected on how dramatically her professional perspective had shifted in just 3 weeks. The clinical detachment she had maintained for 15 years, necessary armor in the difficult world of shelter medicine, had been gently but persistently challenged by this experience. Atlas's case had reminded her that medical decisions should be informed by data and resources, but also by the recognition that healing sometimes followed paths that defied conventional expectations. When compassion aligned with expertise and determination, possibilities emerged that standard protocols might never have discovered. And perhaps most significantly, she had been reminded that sometimes the wisest perspective came from those unburdened by professional caution, from an 8-year-old who saw not a paralyzed dog requiring euthanasia, but simply Atlas, who just needed help remembering how to walk again. The Willowbrook Animal Shelter's conference room had never hosted such a diverse gathering. The long oak table, typically surrounded by shelter board members, discussing budget constraints and adoption. Statistics now accommodated an unprecedented assembly of professionals from seemingly disparate fields. Veterinarians sat alongside physical therapists, shelter administrators next to hospital department directors, all drawn together by the remarkable case that had unexpectedly bridged their professional worlds. Michael Harrington, Willowbrook's director, surveyed the assembled group with measured satisfaction. When Dr. Winters had first approached him about a special exemption for a paralyzed German shepherd, he had approved primarily to maintain community goodwill, expecting modest results at best. Now, 1 month later, the shelter was hosting what amounted to a medical symposium, with Atlas's case at its center. "Before we begin the formal presentation," Michael announced, calling the meeting to order, "I want to thank everyone for making time for this unprecedented collaboration, particularly our colleagues from Mapleton Regional Hospital, whose expertise and resources have made this project possible." Dr. Robert Chen, Mapleton Regional's Chief Medical Officer, nodded acknowledgement. His presence demonstrated the significance the hospital had placed on this initiative, elevating it from an informal arrangement to an officially recognized community partnership. "We've found this collaboration remarkably valuable from the medical perspective as well," Dr. Chen replied. "The cross-species application of rehabilitation techniques has generated insights potentially beneficial for our human patients. Our Physical Therapy Department has already implemented several modifications to our pediatric protocols based on observations from this case." This exchange, hospital administrator and shelter director acknowledging mutual benefit, represented the institutional framework that had developed around Atlas's recovery journey. What had begun as one dog's reprieve from euthanasia had evolved into a formalized initiative with implications for both animal welfare and human medicine. Dr. Winters rose to begin her presentation, connecting her laptop to the conference room's projection system. The screen displayed a professional title slide, "Atlas Project: Cross-Disciplinary Approaches to Canine Neurological Rehabilitation." 4 weeks ago, Eleanor began, her tone balancing clinical precision with genuine engagement, Atlas was scheduled for euthanasia due to complete hindquarter paralysis of unknown origin. Today, I'll be presenting documentation of his progress under an intensive rehabilitation protocol developed through collaboration between Willowbrook Shelter and Mapleton Regional Hospital's Rehabilitation Department. The initial slides provided context: Atlas's condition upon arrival at the shelter, the standard assessment process, and the typical prognosis for similar cases within resource-constrained shelter environments. This background established the baseline against which his subsequent progress would be measured. The intervention began when 8-year-old Madison Taylor, the daughter of Sarah Taylor, Mapleton Regional's Neurological Rehabilitation Director, identified potential parallels between Atlas's condition and human spinal cord injury cases. Eleanor continued, transitioning to photographs of the Taylor home modified for Atlas's rehabilitation. Sarah Taylor, seated beside her colleagues from the hospital, maintained professional composure as the presentation highlighted her department's contributions. Yet beneath this clinical exterior, she felt a complex mixture of emotions: professional pride in the innovative protocol they had developed, and maternal pride in Madison's catalyst role in the entire process. The rehabilitation approach integrated 3 key components, Eleanor explained, advancing to a slide detailing the therapeutic protocol. Daily home-based exercises adapted from human neurological rehabilitation techniques, twice-weekly hydrotherapy sessions utilizing the hospital's specialized equipment, and a progressive mobility support system that adjusted to Atlas's changing capabilities. The technical portion of the presentation continued with data charts tracking measurable parameters of Atlas's recovery, muscle mass increases, joint mobility improvements, and progressively longer durations of independent standing. These quantifiable metrics provided the evidence-based foundation necessary for institutional evaluation. Then, the presentation shifted to video documentation, and the atmosphere in the conference room subtly changed. Numbers and charts had established clinical credibility, but the footage now playing on screen provided something different, visible evidence of a transformation that statistics alone couldn't capture. The first video showed Atlas in the hydrotherapy pool during his initial session, making those first tentative kicking motions that had signaled neural pathways beginning to re-establish. Subsequent clips documented his progression over 4 weeks, from supported standing to assisted walking, from hesitant steps to increasingly confident movement patterns. Throughout these videos, Madison appeared at the edge of frame or beside Atlas, sometimes assisting with equipment, often providing encouragement, always maintaining that unwavering certainty that had characterized her approach from the beginning. Her presence in this clinical documentation highlighted the unique element she had brought to the rehabilitation process, a quality difficult to quantify in medical terminology, but unmistakable in its impact. The final video had been recorded just yesterday. It showed Atlas in the tailor's backyard, wearing a minimal support harness that provided safety but no active assistance. Madison stood approximately 15 feet away, calling to him. With deliberate concentration evident in his focused expression, Atlas walked the entire distance independently, his gait still showing asymmetry and occasional hesitation, but demonstrating functional mobility that would have seemed impossible 4 weeks earlier. When the lights came up following this concluding footage, the conference room remained momentarily silent, professional composure briefly suspended as the assembled experts absorbed the visual evidence of Atlas's remarkable progress. Dr. Chen was the first to speak. "The rate of neurological recovery is extraordinary," he observed, his clinical assessment tinged with genuine admiration. Even in optimal human rehabilitation scenarios, this progression timeline would be considered exceptional. Dr. Patricia Larson, who had supervised Atlas's hydrotherapy sessions, offered additional context from her specialized perspective. "We believe several factors contributed to the accelerated recovery pattern. The intensive protocol provided ideal neurological stimulation frequency, while the cross-disciplinary approach allowed us to adapt techniques from both veterinary and human medicine. Additionally," she paused, seeking the appropriate professional terminology. "The constant encouragement from his primary caregiver created an optimal psychological environment for recovery." This carefully phrased acknowledgement of Madison's role reflected the challenge medical professionals faced in quantifying the impact of human connection and unwavering belief within evidence-based practice. The documentation clearly demonstrated Atlas's physical progress, but capturing Madison's contribution required language that bridged clinical assessment and emotional intelligence. Michael Harrington, focused on the institutional implications, raised practical questions about sustainability and scalability. "The results are undeniably impressive, but we need to consider implementation beyond this individual case. The resources devoted to Atlas's rehabilitation far exceed our standard capabilities." This observation addressed the central challenge facing the shelter: how to translate an exceptional case involving specialized hospital resources into protocols that could benefit other animals within typical shelter constraints. Dr. Winters had anticipated this concern. "Our recommendation includes a tiered approach to rehabilitation assessment and intervention," she explained, advancing to a new slide showing a decision tree for evaluating special needs cases. Not every animal requires the intensive protocol Atlas received. Many could benefit significantly from basic rehabilitation techniques that could be implemented within standard shelter operations. The presentation shifted to address this practical application, outlining graduated intervention levels ranging from simple enrichment activities to specialized rehabilitation partnerships for the most promising cases. This framework provided the administrative structure necessary for institutional adoption, translating an inspiring individual story into sustainable policy. As the formal presentation concluded and discussion began among the assembled professionals, a shelter volunteer discreetly entered the conference room, approaching Michael with a whispered message. He nodded, then addressed the group. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have some additional participants who would like to join us, if that's agreeable." At his signal, the door opened wider to admit Sarah Taylor, who had briefly stepped out during the discussion. She returned accompanied by Madison, dressed in her therapy assistant t-shirt with her handmade badge, and Atlas himself, wearing a specialized mobility harness but walking into the conference room under his own power. The German shepherd moved. With the deliberate concentration of someone navigating with newly relearned skills, his gait showing the slight asymmetry documented in the presentation videos. Yet his progress across the conference room floor, approximately 30 feet from door to table, demonstrated functional mobility that simply didn't align with his condition just 4 weeks earlier. Madison maintained perfect pace beside him, neither hurrying his progress nor providing unnecessary assistance. Her expression showed focused attention rather than anxious hovering, the demeanor of a rehabilitation assistant who understood precisely when support was needed and when independence should be encouraged. "The Atlas Project team thought you might appreciate meeting the patient in person," Sarah explained, professional in her presentation despite the unconventional addition to a board meeting. The effect on the assembled professionals was immediate and pronounced. Medical data and video documentation had established clinical credibility, but Atlas's physical presence, walking into the room that had once approved his euthanasia, created an emotional impact that transcended professional analysis. Board members, who had reviewed countless case files and approved difficult resource allocation decisions, now witnessed the living embodiment of what their exceptional approval had made possible. Hospital administrators, who had authorized facility use for an unprecedented cross-disciplinary initiative, saw tangible evidence of its success. Madison, demonstrating remarkable poise for an 8-year-old in a room full of professionals, guided Atlas to the front of the conference table. "Atlas wanted to thank you himself for giving him a chance," she announced with simple directness. "He's worked really hard to learn to walk again." The anthropomorphic attribution, giving Atlas agency in expressing gratitude, might have seemed childishly naive in another context, yet in this moment it captured something essential about the case that clinical terminology couldn't articulate. Atlas's recovery had indeed required medical expertise and innovative therapeutic approaches, but it had also depended on his own determined participation in the process, his willingness to attempt movement patterns that his injured nervous system struggled to execute. Dr. Chen, whose administrative authority had been crucial in approving the hospital's participation, addressed Madison directly. "You've been an important part of Atlas's rehabilitation team, I understand." Madison nodded seriously. "I'm his therapy assistant. I help him remember that he can do things even when they seem impossible at first." The straightforward response contained wisdom that resonated beyond its simple wording. A fundamental principle of rehabilitation medicine expressed with childlike clarity. Recovery from catastrophic injury often depended as much on psychological factors as physical interventions, on maintaining belief in possibility when objective evidence suggested limitation. Michael Harrington, recognizing the powerful impact of this unplanned demonstration, directed the conversation toward constructive action. Dr. Winters has presented a framework for implementing graduated rehabilitation protocols within our standard operations. The board will need to evaluate resource allocation for this initiative. He paused, looking at Atlas standing attentively beside Madison. However, I believe we've witnessed compelling evidence for the potential benefits of such a program. The discussion transitioned to practical implementation, training requirements for shelter staff, equipment needs for basic rehabilitation activities, criteria for identifying appropriate candidates for intervention. Throughout this administrative conversation, Atlas remained positioned beside Madison, occasionally shifting his weight but maintaining his standing position with remarkable endurance compared to his capabilities just weeks earlier. As the meeting concluded, board members and hospital representatives approached to observe Atlas more closely, many kneeling to interact with him at eye level. These professionals, accustomed to evaluating cases through data and documentation, now engaged directly with the individual at the center of the initiative they were considering. Dr. Winters watched these interactions with quiet satisfaction. The presentation had provided all the technical information necessary for institutional decision-making, but Atlas's physical presence offered something equally important: the tangible reality of what rehabilitation could accomplish when expertise aligned with compassion and determination. As the group dispersed, Michael Harrington approached Sarah and Madison. The board will vote on the formal partnership proposal next week, but I've been authorized to inform you that Atlas's foster placement has been approved for extension through his complete rehabilitation journey. He smiled slightly, acknowledging the bureaucratic understatement in this phrasing, though I suspect we all recognize that Atlas has already found his permanent home. The comment referenced the unspoken reality that had become increasingly apparent through the documentation, the profound bond that had developed between Atlas and the Taylor family, particularly Madison. What had begun as a temporary rehabilitation, foster placement, had evolved into something far more significant for everyone involved. Madison's face brightened with undisguised joy at this confirmation, while Sarah's expression reflected the more complex considerations of a parent making a significant family commitment. Yet her slight nod acknowledged the inevitability Michael had identified. Atlas had indeed become more than a rehabilitation patient in their household. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Chen approached with one final observation. "You know," he said thoughtfully, watching Atlas walking steadily beside Madison toward the exit, "in medical literature, we occasionally encounter cases described as remarkable or exceptional. What's particularly valuable about such cases isn't just the individual outcome, though that matters tremendously to those involved." He paused, choosing his words with the precision of someone accustomed to addressing multiple levels of meaning. Their greatest contribution is often in expanding our understanding of what's possible, challenging our assumptions about limitations and recovery potential. Atlas's case has accomplished that for both our institutions. This assessment, framed in measured professional terminology, acknowledged the broader significance emerging from one German shepherd's journey from scheduled euthanasia to walking recovery. Beyond the individual story lay implications for how both the shelter and hospital might approach similar cases in the future, with greater openness to possibility and innovative collaboration. As Atlas walked out of the Willowbrook conference room under his own power, guided by the 8-year-old who had first insisted on his potential for recovery, he represented something beyond his personal journey, a living embodiment of what becomes possible when medical expertise aligns with unwavering belief in the resilience of life seeking to heal. 6 weeks into Atlas's rehabilitation journey, autumn arrived in Mapleton with a dramatic shift in weather. The warm summer days that had allowed for outdoor therapy sessions in the Taylor's backyard gave way to chilly mornings and persistent drizzle. Golden leaves carpeted the lawn where Atlas had practiced his walking exercises, creating a slippery surface unsuitable for a dog still mastering his balance. These seasonal changes coincided with a plateau in Atlas's progress that concerned the rehabilitation team. After the remarkable advancements during his first month of therapy, his improvement had noticeably slowed. The asymmetry in his gait remained pronounced, with his right hind leg consistently stronger than his left. His endurance had increased to approximately 50 yards of independent walking before fatigue set in. But this measurement had remained static for nearly 2 weeks, despite continued intensive therapy. Sarah Taylor sat at her dining room table, which remained transformed into a rehabilitation command center, reviewing Atlas's progress charts with Dr. Winters and Dr. Larson. The data painted a clear picture, a steep upward curve of improvement that had flattened into a horizontal line. This plateau isn't unexpected from a neurological rehabilitation perspective, Dr. Larson observed, comparing Atlas's metrics to similar human recovery patterns. After the initial reconnection of functional neural pathways, we typically see a slowdown as the rehabilitation process transitions from recovery of existing circuits to the formation of entirely new connections. Dr. Winters nodded in clinical agreement. The veterinary literature describes similar patterns in canine spinal injury cases. The question becomes whether this represents a temporary plateau or his maximum functional recovery point. Sarah understood these patterns from her professional experience, but recognizing them in Atlas's case created a complex emotional response. The initial weeks had generated such dramatic improvements that this sudden stagnation felt disproportionately disappointing, despite being clinically predictable. "We need to reevaluate our approach," she suggested, shifting into problem-solving mode. "Perhaps introduce new challenges that stimulate different neural pathways." The literature increasingly suggests that novel stimuli can trigger neuroplastic adaptations even during apparent plateaus. As the professionals discussed potential modifications to Atlas's rehabilitation protocol, Madison sat cross-legged on the living room floor beside him, seemingly untroubled by the concerns occupying the adults. She was reading aloud from a children's book about service dogs, occasionally showing Atlas the illustrations as though he could appreciate them. "Madison," Sarah called gently, interrupting the one-sided storytelling session. "We're discussing some changes to Atlas's therapy routine. Would you like to join the conversation?" Madison carefully marked her place in the book before joining the adults at the table. At just 8 years old, she had absorbed an impressive understanding of rehabilitation principles, often offering observations about Atlas's responses that the professionals found remarkably insightful. "Atlas is getting bored," Madison stated with characteristic directness as she climbed onto a chair. "He knows all his exercises now, and they're not exciting anymore." The adults exchanged thoughtful glances, recognizing the potential validity in this simple assessment. Neurological rehabilitation required intensive repetition of specific movement patterns, but this necessary repetition could indeed lead to diminished engagement, a factor rarely addressed in clinical literature but potentially significant for outcomes. "That's an interesting observation," Dr. Larson acknowledged. "Emotional engagement definitely influences neurological rehabilitation results in human patients. We often modify protocols not just for physical progression, but to maintain psychological investment." Dr. Winters considered this perspective. "What makes you think Atlas is bored with his exercises, Madison?" "He sighs a lot now when we get out the therapy equipment," Madison explained, mimicking the deep exhalation she had observed. "And he watches the squirrels in the yard instead of focusing on his walking practice. Before, he would concentrate really hard on each step, This behavioral observation carried the unmistakable ring of truth. Atlas had indeed shown declining enthusiasm for his structured therapy sessions, though he continued to participate with the characteristic determination that had impressed everyone throughout his recovery journey. If motivation is potentially affecting his progress, we should address that as systematically as we approach the physical aspects of rehabilitation, Sarah suggested, already considering potential modifications to their approach. Dr. Winters made notes on her tablet. The challenge becomes identifying activities that maintain therapeutic benefit while introducing novel stimulation. Madison had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience, her expression suggesting she had an obvious solution. The adults were overlooking. Finally, she could contain herself no longer. "Atlas needs a friend," she declared emphatically. "Someone to play with and show him how dogs are supposed to move. That would be way more fun than just doing exercises all day." The simplicity of this suggestion created a moment of reflection among the professionals. Their focus on structured, therapeutic interventions had perhaps overlooked a fundamental aspect of recovery, the natural learning that occurs through social interaction and observation. Canine modeling is actually supported in veterinary rehabilitation literature. Dr. Winters noted her professional knowledge connecting with Madison's intuitive suggestion. Dogs with mobility limitations often show improved gait patterns after interaction with normally ambulatory dogs. They essentially recalibrate their movement patterns through observation and social engagement. Sarah considered the practical implications. We'd need to find a dog with the right temperament, calm enough not to overwhelm Atlas, but playful enough to encourage movement. And they would need to be introduced carefully, given Atlas's physical vulnerability. "I know. The perfect dog," Madison exclaimed with sudden excitement. "Rosie from my school. She's a therapy dog who visits kids in the hospital. She's super gentle but really good at playing, and her mom is Mrs. Bennett, my art teacher." This enthusiastic recommendation led to a flurry of arrangements. By the following afternoon, the Taylors' backyard had been prepared for a carefully supervised introduction between Atlas and Rosie, a golden retriever certified as a therapy dog through Mapleton Regional's patient support program. Linda Bennett, Madison's art teacher and Rosie's owner, had responded with immediate interest when contacted about the potential canine therapy session. As the coordinator of the school district's art therapy initiatives, she understood the value of innovative approaches to healing and was intrigued by the possibility of extending therapy dog benefits to another canine. "Rosie has worked with children who use mobility assistance devices," Linda explained as she and Sarah watched the initial, controlled introduction in the backyard. "She's naturally careful around individuals with physical limitations." This sensitivity was immediately apparent as Rosie approached Atlas with gentle curiosity, her body language communicating friendly interest without overwhelming energy. Atlas, initially cautious, gradually relaxed as he assessed this new presence. In his territory, after several minutes of careful sniffing and circling, the two dogs appeared to reach an understanding, settling into a comfortable proximity that suggested potential for positive interaction. Madison, who had been restraining her excitement during this careful introduction, could contain herself no longer. "Can I show Rosie how Atlas is learning to walk again?" she asked, vibrating with enthusiasm for this new development in Atlas's rehabilitation journey. With Sarah's agreement, Madison demonstrated Atlas's walking exercises using the verbal cues and hand signals that had become part of their established routine. Atlas responded with noticeably greater engagement than he had shown in recent days. His attention divided between following Madison's guidance and maintaining awareness of his canine visitor. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. As Atlas completed his walking circuit along the yard's perimeter path, Rosie spontaneously fell into step beside him, matching her pace to his slower, slightly asymmetrical gait. The golden retriever, trained to attune to human emotional and physical needs, appeared to instinctively recognize Atlas's rehabilitation efforts and adapted her movement to provide companionship without interference. "Look!" Madison exclaimed. "Rosie's showing Atlas how to walk like a regular dog, but she's doing it slowly so he can keep up." The adults observed with professional interest as this unplanned therapeutic intervention unfolded. Atlas, clearly responding to Rosie's presence, maintained his walking effort for significantly longer than his recent sessions, completing 3 circuits of the yard before showing signs of fatigue. His gait pattern actually appears more normalized. During this interaction, Sarah noted with clinical precision, though her tone revealed underlying excitement at this unexpected development. The left hind leg is engaging more consistently in the stepping sequence. Linda, whose experience with therapy dogs had exposed her to numerous examples of their intuitive responses to human needs, was nonetheless impressed by Rosie's spontaneous adaptation to another canine's rehabilitation process. "Therapy dogs are selected and trained for sensitivity to physical and emotional cues," she explained. "But I've never seen Rosie apply those skills to another dog before. This is fascinating." By the session's conclusion, the potential of this approach was evident to everyone present. Atlas had engaged in more sustained physical activity than any recent therapy session, with observable improvements in his movement patterns. Equally significant was his visibly elevated mood, a renewed enthusiasm that contrasted sharply with the diminished engagement the team had noted over the previous 2 weeks. "I believe Madison's intuition about Atlas needing canine companionship was remarkably astute," Dr. Winters commented during the team's debrief after Rosie and Linda had departed. "The social component of rehabilitation is well documented in human medicine, but perhaps underutilized in veterinary applications." Sarah nodded agreement, already conceptualizing how to integrate this approach into Atlas's revised rehabilitation protocol. "We could establish regular play dates with Rosie as a complement to the structured therapy sessions. The natural movement patterns that emerge during social interaction might help address the asymmetrical gait issues we've been working on." Dr. Larson, who had been reviewing the video recordings of the session, offered additional perspective. "There's another factor worth considering. The plateau we've observed might partly result from Atlas becoming too conscious of his movement patterns during structured therapy. The spontaneous activity stimulated by social engagement could bypass that self-consciousness, allowing more natural neural pathway development." This technical observation highlighted an important rehabilitation principle. Sometimes progress required not more intense focus, but rather the ability to engage movement patterns without excessive conscious control. The playful distraction provided by canine companionship might create precisely this condition. As the professionals developed a revised protocol incorporating these insights, Madison sat with Atlas on his orthopedic bed, recounting the day's excitement with animated descriptions. "Rosie is going to come back on Thursday," she informed him earnestly. "And Mrs. Bennett says maybe we can try the therapy room at school someday, where they have special floors that aren't slippery for kids. With walkers, wouldn't that be amazing?" Atlas listened with characteristic attentiveness, his amber eyes following Madison's expressive hand gestures. Though unable to comprehend the specific content of her communication, he clearly responded to her renewed enthusiasm, his tail offering occasional gentle thumps against the cushioned surface. That evening, as Sarah reviewed the day's developments while preparing dinner, she reflected on how consistently Madison's intuitive suggestions had proven valuable throughout Atlas's rehabilitation journey. While the professional team contributed essential medical expertise and technical knowledge, Madison's uncomplicated perspective often identified elements they overlooked: the importance of enjoyment in the recovery process, the motivational impact of social connection, the value of seeing capability demonstrated by others. "You know," Sarah commented to Madison as they set the table, "your idea about Atlas needing a canine friend was really insightful. All of us professionals were focused so intently on exercise protocols and measurement data that we missed something fundamental." Madison accepted this acknowledgement with matter-of-fact composure. "Atlas is still a dog," she replied simply. "Even though he's learning to walk again, he needs regular dog things too, like friends and games and exploring interesting smells." The observation carried wisdom that transcended its straightforward delivery, a reminder that rehabilitation addressed the whole individual, not merely the specific function being restored. Atlas wasn't just a collection of neural pathways and muscle groups requiring retraining. He was a sentient being with social needs, emotional responses, and quality-of-life considerations that influenced his recovery as significantly as any structured intervention. As they prepared for bed that night, Sarah noticed Atlas attempting something new. Instead of settling directly onto his orthopedic bed in Madison's room, his established sleeping location, he made deliberate, if awkward, efforts to climb onto Madison's bed. After several determined attempts, he managed to pull himself up, circling twice before settling at the foot of the mattress with a contented sigh. Madison looked to her mother with silent plea, her expression both hopeful and uncertain whether this development would be permitted. Sarah hesitated, weighing practical concerns against the significance of Atlas's independent initiative. This self-determined action represented precisely the kind of motivated, functional mobility they had been working to develop, using his recovering abilities to achieve something personally meaningful rather than simply completing prescribed exercises. "Just for tonight," Sarah conceded, with a smile that suggested she recognized this exception would likely become permanent. "He's earned it with his hard work today." Madison's face illuminated with joy as she settled beside Atlas, gently stroking his head. "See," she whispered, "you figured out how to get on the bed all by yourself. That wasn't even one of our therapy exercises." In this quiet moment, the essence of Atlas's journey was distilled to its fundamental elements, not just the technical process of neurological rehabilitation, but the deeper story of a living being reclaiming agency and capability through determination, support, and the powerful motivation of meaningful connection. The plateau that had concerned the rehabilitation team now appeared in a different light, not an endpoint but a transition requiring adjustments to their approach. With the introduction of canine companionship and the natural movement patterns it encouraged, Atlas's recovery journey had found a new path forward, guided as always by Madison's unwavering belief in possibilities the adults might otherwise have overlooked. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.